Unfortunately for the people of Hokianga, the market has not been kind to them. What is worse, a feature of free market culture is to blame people like these for their growing poverty. So what does populist New Zealand politician Winston Peters see as the legacy of his country's experience?
A divided society where the rich have got richer or consolidated, and the poor have expanded in number, quite massive unemployment in historic terms alongside New Zealand's record, and what you might call an exclusive rather than an inclusive society. In the racial context, you've got something like half the long-term unemployed who are now Maori. I mean, we're buying serious social problems at this point in time.
This America's Cup yacht is the most striking symbol of life at the other end of the scale. Inspired by Alan Bond's 1983 win, Auckland merchant bankers Michael Fay and David Richwhite and their backers have sunk an estimated $100 million over the last 6 years into their pursuit of the elusive silver trophy. The dream came to an abrupt end on May the 1st when their so-called red sled was eliminated by the Italian yacht Il Moro di Venezia. The loss also chipped the invincibility of free marketeer Michael Fay and his admiring partner, David Richwhite.
He understands the dynamics of the financial side of it. He understands the organisation that is required. He understands the discipline that's required.
The costly gamble in San Diego did not impress Desney Harris, a single mum struggling to support her children on welfare. She typifies the growing numbers of urban poor in New Zealand. For them, the America's Cup Challenge demonstrates the growing imbalance in New Zealand society.
Michael Fay is Fay Richwhite. He represents big business. He's forked out $68 million for it. People are very bitter towards that. I mean, they're just getting richer and the people in New Zealand are getting poorer, and there are more of them.
But at the big end of town, hopes were high that success for Fay in San Diego would trigger a property boom in Auckland.
If you are that sure America's Cup will not be here, I will bet my bottom dollar.
We're talking now about a commercial deal. The one thing that the America's Cup has as distinct from all other sporting contests, you bring an industry with it. You win the cup and you win the industry. And that, of course, is what a lot of people are looking to.
How strong will this make Michael Fay as a businessman in New Zealand if he wins this cup?
Well, Michael's got a significant catchment of the New Zealand market now. It'll certainly do him no harm.
Michael Fay's prosperity may have been set back by this loss, but the country's prospects are much worse. New Zealand, in effect, has been wagered like a gambling chip as part of a massive program of privatisation and deregulation by both Labour and national governments. Even Auckland Central Railway Station is being offered for sale as a casino site. Already, governments here have sold 42% of the country's biggest bank, the Bank of New Zealand, all of its national airline, its oil and gas interests, state forests, the national telephone company Telecom, and a host of small enterprises. Assets on the block include the post office, the electricity system, and New Zealand Rail. Tens of thousands of jobs have been lost in these efficiency drives and sell-offs. The jobs have not been found elsewhere, as the textbooks would suggest.
Never before have there been such excellent fundamentals in the New Zealand economy, and we mean to demonstrate to you here in Asia that we represent a very good bet.
New Zealand is building a new economy, an economy that's open, dynamic, competitive and friendly.
Meanwhile, the government has been wooing Asian investors to excite some interest in the country. Finance Minister Ruth Richardson rounded up some of the big noises in business to hawk New Zealand as a place to invest.
Both in business and investment. We are one of the most open and deregulated economies in the world now.
Foreign investors have already picked up the cream. By wooing the Asian markets, the government clearly believes most of the remaining assets also will go overseas.
And it seems ironic now that we have a Minister of Finance who's hawking big business associates around Southeast Asia to try to attract investment in New Zealand, whereas I'm perfectly certain that there are hundreds of millions of New Zealand dollars invested overseas, say in a country like Australia, which ought to be invested back home for the benefit of our own industries. But nobody in their right mind will bring their money back until we have trustworthy directors who will give confidence to the small shareholders.
This is a story about the way business is done in New Zealand, virtually unhindered by regulation and where the corporate watchdogs have no teeth. It's also a tale of the country's central financial institution, the Bank of New Zealand, which went to the brink of collapse. And it's about the role of Michael Fay and David Richwhite, who control the biggest non-government stake in the bank. Their pink granite headquarters is the flashiest high-rise in downtown Auckland, but neither Fay nor Richwhite would talk to Four Corners. Their ascendancy has been remarkable. The two have been major beneficiaries of the privatisation process, earning huge fees as advisors to the deals. In June 1990, Fay was knighted by the previous Labour government for services to banking and yachting. His partner, Richwhite, is a driving force in the powerful free enterprise business lobby group, the Business Roundtable.
A segment of the Business Roundtable has an inordinate influence over a government in New Zealand, and again, that happened under the previous administration. I believe it's still to be the case today.
We will smash the BRT! Put them under lock and key!
The Unemployed Workers Union picked their target carefully when they visited Sir Michael's home last year to protest against the influence of big business and its lobby group, the Business Roundtable.
It's 8:15. It's Radio Pacific. Our number's 309 3099. Here's our Joe Gilfillan.
International news.
Popular current affairs breakfast announcer Pam Corkery has an audience of 500,000. She reckons she has a good feel for public opinion and their views of the power of big business in this small country.
What frightens me is that the Business Roundtable are so far right, and at the moment with the government distancing themselves verbally only from their philosophies, it is this good copper, bad copper routine. Only the Business Roundtable could make this government look moderate at the moment. 8:27.
What does big business want out of governments in New Zealand?
Like all businesses, they want an environment that's conducive to their interests. But the real myth is that what's good for business is good for all New Zealanders. Now, that has always been a myth in every other country, and it is a myth in New Zealand.
I don't know if that will be enough to stop it. They seem very determined.
Winston Peters may be wary of big business, but the two leaders, Prime Minister Jim Bolger and Labour's Mike Moore, were eager participants at a fundraising function in the Parliament building for Michael Fay's now failed America's Cup adventure. Political differences were buried for their delivery of the latest Cup news by satellite.
You've got a tremendous amount of support from across New Zealand. In fact, I think it's building.
Despite the enthusiasm of the politicians at this function, Sir Michael realised the unpopularity of his latest campaign when a public outcry forced him to hand back $1 million he sought from the Lottery Grants Board, money normally which would have gone to needy charities.
I mean, the man, the bigger the boys, the bigger the toys. He and his mate and their very wealthy other co-sponsors, $65 million into it. And he asks for $1 million from taxpayers in a recessed society. He's lost his popularity contest with the public, I would say.
Fay shielded his bid from criticism by wrapping the campaign in the national flag. So too did his backers, like the Bank of New Zealand. But this BNZ television ad came at the worst of times for the people of Hokianga.
You used to think it was probably the biggest rugby ground in the world, the under-8s and you. Too small to run the length, so you used to play from one side to the other.
The reaction was, in a sense, anger, because it came right hard on the heels of the withdrawal of all banking services from Hokianga. So to see that a few days later didn't go down too well at all locally.
Who are you? You're a New Zealander. And who are we? We are your bank.
The jingoistic slogans of the bank's image makers, stirring up a bit of America's Cup emotion, mean very little here. In tiny Kohu in New Zealand's far north, unemployment and poverty are the worst in the country. Towns like this are struggling to survive. Because the people have no money here, newly privatised government services one by one are being cut back or withdrawn, isolating the community further. Banks, the post office, bus services are virtually non-existent. In spite of the public apathy for his Cup bid, Sir Michael Fay did manage to find a very generous sponsor in the state-owned television network. Television New Zealand gave his campaign $20 million. But the failure of the Cup bid also meant television switched off across the land. TVNZ and its advertisers had bought a lemon.
This week in San Diego, proudly presented by...
Not before the New Zealand public was treated to a look at San Diego's down and outs and a patronising handout of New Zealand lamb.
With times as tough as they are these days, it's hard to imagine not even having enough change to buy a burger. Well, here at the St Vincent de Paul village, thousands line up to get their one daily meal, and usually it's just stew or soup. But today, however, they're being treated to New Zealand lamb.
Think twice.
This was more than the poor of Hokianga got out of the extravagant Cup campaign.
Think twice, 'cause it's another day for you. You and me in paradise.
3 young ladies headed to some quick stake. Girls from high school carrying the Bank of New Zealand flag.
Back in 1987, Sir Michael was feted as a national hero after he returned from the America's Cup races off Fremantle. This is despite the fact that he didn't even make the final against the Australian defender, Kookaburra. It was this challenge which brought him together for the first time with the BNZ, which had financed his plastic boat campaign. But the sailing bug had bitten Fay. He went back for more in 1988, and this time he challenged 1987 winner Dennis Connor and the San Diego Yacht Club in a huge boat he believed was within the rules. The unpredictable Connor wasn't to be outmanoeuvred though.
I'm sailing a cat. Somebody else is sailing a dog.
Fay's big boat wasn't in the race against Connor's slick catamaran. But at the same time, on the back of his yachting reputation, Michael Fay pulled off a spectacular deal back home in which big business interests trampled over small investors. Even in New Zealand's colourful corporate history, the 1988 takeover of retailer LD Nathan by Lion Breweries is breathtaking and underlies the weakness of corporate law in the country. Fay and Rich White bought 35% of Nathan, which owned New Zealand's Decca and Woolworths stores. Weeks later, the country's biggest brewer, Lion Breweries, launched a takeover bid for the retailer. Fay and Rich White demanded $360 million cash for their shares, $150 million more than the market price of the time. Small shareholders got only one Lion share worth 40% less than the cash Fay and Rich White were being paid.
I was completely outraged. I thought it was totally unfair and unjust to the minority shareholders. And I said so at the meeting to discuss the merger. I also found it incomprehensible that Sir Michael Fay was complaining that Dennis Connors was inventing one set of rules for the defenders and another one for the people who are trying to gain the America's Cup. But at the same time, he was proposing in the Lion-Nathan merger that there was one set of rules for the ordinary shareholder and one set of rules for the privileged people. And the analogy really was complete. He was playing the rules to the advantage of the privileged man for all he was worth.
Martin Finlay, are minorities getting a fair go with some of these recent reconstructions we've had?
No, I'm sure they're not. The essence of any shareholder in any given class is that of equity, and the familiar phrase of the law is that equality is equity, or equity is equality. And I'm quite certain that the minority shareholders are getting the dirty end of the stick on many occasions.
Martin Finlay took the complaint of small shareholders to a Securities Commission inquiry into the takeover. The Securities Commission hearing found no wrongdoing, despite the fact that the takeover breached the Stock Exchange's takeover code stating that all shareholders should be offered the same price.
Yes, well.
In its wisdom, the Stock Exchange decided that the rule wouldn't apply in this case. Why aren't the rules stronger? Securities Commission Chairman Peter Mackenzie admits that the law is still deficient in this area.
We would like to see more effective regulation introduced to deal with takeovers, and particularly to protect the position of minority shareholders.
How important do you think it is to do that, to achieve that protection of minorities?
Well, I think it's very important for our market for two reasons. I mean, one, to encourage confidence on the part of investors, and particularly the smaller and institutional investors into our market. And secondly, I think to give the signal to overseas markets that New Zealand is not lagging behind in this area. Our market has tended to be under-regulated in relation to takeovers in comparison with almost any of the other markets with which we commonly deal.
The Lion Nathan merger happened 4 years ago. There's still no law in New Zealand to protect small shareholders. Why have governments been so slow to move?
I think there's a good deal of pressure on them not to do so. The source of it is undoubtedly that organisation known as the Business Roundtable, which exercises a great amount of influence on a number of spheres, and particularly on administration. It's the voice of the big corporations and the big financial battalions.
Winston Peters is New Zealand's #1 choice for Prime Minister, but he has been sidelined by the national government hierarchy. He couldn't resist the chance in Sydney to mix with some Kiwi League stars. A person more comfortable with the players than the managers, Winston Peters likes to play it by the book. In New Zealand, Peters has been relegated to the backbench because he has kicked against the free market policies followed so zealously by his parliamentary colleagues. Big Business is happy to have him out of the game, but not before the Business Roundtable tried to get him on side.
Well, for some time I'd been asked to come and see a certain group in the round table. In fact, it was put to me that it was churlish not to. It was actually, it would be bad manners not to talk to them, so in the interests of public propriety I did. But I was pretty certain as to what the conversation would be about, and it was about that. It was about my swinging behind a certain economic philosophy, and so it went. It was fine wine, and the meal was lovely, but there was going to be no business between us on that matter, over and above the interests of what I perceived was the good of New Zealand.
That meeting took place in Faye Richwhite's opulent offices. A fortnight later, a round table member not at the meeting phoned Peters with an offer of help.
And I, just as a matter of curiosity, said, "What do you mean by help? Do you mean money?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, how much?" And I nominated a few figures, and each figure was agreed to. And I said, "Well, look, I'm not prepared to sell out the people that I represent in either my constituency or nationwide."
What sort of money was he talking about?
It seemed to me that there was no limit to support my campaign, whatever they perceived my campaign to be.
And what did you want in return?
That wasn't made clear. But I had suspicions that once I was on the ticket, then I was clearly in my mind, and publicly I would have been bought.
Nothing illustrates better the cosy relationship between big business and government than the saga of the country's main bank, the Bank of New Zealand. It was the first privatisation experiment by the swashbuckling Labor government of David Lange, when it sold 12% of the bank to the public back in 1986. What happened to the BNZ over the ensuing years says a lot about privatisation and government relations with the private sector, and its hard guns, the merchant bankers, in such a liberal economy. In the process, this bank, which is used by every second person in New Zealand, nearly went broke. In June 1989, the bank was in big trouble after the stock market crash, and a collapsing property market in New Zealand forced it to write off more than $1 billion worth of loans which had gone bad.
Which means that the extent to which money is now being put aside enables this bank to say with confidence, that's it, we've put all that behind us.
Nevertheless, the government had to raise $600 million to rescue the bank. Enter Michael Fay and David Richwhite. The pair had already moved behind the scenes to buy a major shareholding, believing that the worst was over.
A profit or a loss to the consortium.
In a secret deal, the Labor government sold 30% of the bank to Capital Markets, a listed company controlled by the two men. Trouble is, to buy the shares, Capital Markets had to borrow all of the $308 million, mostly from the State Bank of South Australia. The purchase also caught the BNZ's directors by surprise. One of the board members at the time was economist Len Bayliss.
No, we had no knowledge at all of the transaction or of any of the agreements or details of the transaction. There were agreements made between the government and Fay Richwhite, but none of the members of the board, the independent members, were privy to those.
But the smartest operators in town, who had stitched up some of the cleverest deals, were about to blow it. At the very time Sir Michael committed Capital Markets to the BNZ, the bank was hit by a string of corporate crises and collapses in Australia, on top of the continuing troubles in New Zealand.
After we'd done the provisioning in Australia, that would be in March, settled the accounts then, about that time and shortly afterwards, the Australian corporate sector started to collapse, or a whole lot of really major outfits went bust, one after the other. And clearly the BNZ was heavily involved in the corporate sector, and very clearly we were going to be in trouble.
Fearing a run on the bank if news should leak, the government went into secret talks with Capital Markets, Treasury and the BNZ board to devise a rescue plan. As it lurched towards certain electoral defeat in October 1990, a panicky Labor government could not afford to have any details leaked of the secret negotiations between Treasury, the BNZ board and Fay Richwhite for a desperate rescue package for the troubled bank. Incoming National Party ministers meeting here for the first time a week after the poll were in for a nasty surprise. Winston Peters was one of the new ministers at the cabinet table when the rescue plan was put to them for approval, and he shared the surprise of many of his colleagues.
Some were privy to the information before the rest of Cabinet. Some were, of course, shocked, and some had a sense of history repeating itself because they could see that we were being rushed at a fence in the same way as the Labor administration of '84 was rushed at the devaluation decision.
Why was it such a rush?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it had been around for 5 months, and we were being expected to decide on something within 5 minutes.
The rescue package was favourable to Fay Richwhite. The government put in $620 million and Fay Richwhite $100 million, but is getting a guaranteed return on its money much higher than the government. The new government also agreed to buy $60 million worth of shares from Fay Richwhite to help it make its contribution. Market forces are fine when you're making money, but when the chips are down, it's great to get some help. On top of all this, Fay Richwhite pocketed a share of the total of $194 million in advisory fees the BNZ paid out over the course of the rescue.
Simply my belief was that Fay Richwhite should have been allowed to take the loss like everybody else in a commercial operation of this kind. we could have guaranteed the continuing operations of the BNZ, and maybe at far less cost than currently is the case.
From the financial point of view, of course, it would have been much better if they hadn't been a shareholder. Just why, in fact, they purchased the shareholding has always been a bit of a mystery to me. I don't know why you want to be a minority shareholder in a bank. It would have been far better if the shareholding had been of somebody of much greater financial strength than Fay Richwhite.
This was the second rescue of the BNZ, which has cost taxpayers a total of nearly $1 billion. Yet there has been no official inquiry into the losses. In Australia, Royal Commissions have been examining losses in Rothwell's, Tricontinental and the State Bank of South Australia. In New Zealand, the crisis in its biggest bank has been swept under the carpet.
There are a number of outstanding questions which were present then. They were there as early as June 1990, and in every other circumstance, for example in Australia, where 3 banks have had commissions of inquiries, in one case 2 commissions, that was at least required for the integrity of New Zealand's commercial and financial operations.
Why hasn't there been an inquiry?
I can't explain that either, other than to say that inquiries have been asked for. I believe it may be of embarrassment to certain people in New Zealand to actually have an inquiry.
This extraordinary tale of Fay and Richwhite and the Bank of New Zealand has a twist. Small shareholders in the public company, Capital Markets, were kept in the dark about the rescue plans, despite the fact that it could have severely strained their company. But as the crisis was emerging in the BNZ, Sir Michael Fay and David Richwhite, in another remarkable deal, were asking these same small shareholders to fork out $225 million for the merchant bank privately owned by the high flyers. The merger proposal outraged shareholders like Pat Naden, a retired trotting writer. What angered investors like Pat Naden was the level of so-called goodwill in the price for the Fay and Richwhite merchant bank.
I was more than startled. I was absolutely astonished that the firm that was reputed to, or reckoned to be worth about 40 million, which was the purchase price, was also worth about 180 million in goodwill. Well, for the life of me, I couldn't understand how very few firms would be worth that much. But in this particular case, the assets apparently were only worth 40. How the goodwill could amount to many, many times that figure, God only knows.
I think the reaction to the terms can be really judged in the marketplace in the sense that the share price fell from about 106 to into the 80s. Almost immediately the terms were announced. I think that speaks for itself.
What, the market was saying the price is too high?
Yes.
Capital Markets shareholders met on August the 29th of 1990 to vote on the purchase of Fay and Richwhite's merchant bank. These shareholders were blithely unaware of the closed-door talks to rescue the BNZ. The meeting was sometimes stormy, with a number of investors, such as Queen's Counsel John Allen, questioning the deal.
I felt that Capital Markets had had its punt, so to speak, when it bought a big block of shares in Bank of New Zealand. And in then buying a merchant bank, it was doubling its bets at a not very propitious time.
The chairman of the meeting, Sir Lawrence Stevens, he said at one stage that it didn't really make any difference how we voted at the meeting, or if we hadn't already voted, because there were already enough proxy votes in to carry the day. So it was rather a futile exercise.
Had minority shareholders known that their company was being committed to contributing towards a bailout, totalling hundreds of millions of dollars to save their main investment, the BNZ, would they have voted to approve a further outlay of $225 million? Business valuer Garth Ireland.
I think on balance they would have resisted, obviously, because Capital Markets would have needed resources to support the BNZ interests. And I think that survival at that level would have been the imperative.
The Bank of New Zealand and Capital Markets, or Fay Richwhite as it was known by this time, had 3 common directors. They were Sir Michael Fay and lawyers Robin Congreve and Geoffrey Ricketts. Congreve and Ricketts were so-called independent directors whose duties included the protection of the small shareholders in capital markets. They have declined to tell Four Corners exactly what they knew about the proposals being considered by the BNZ before capital markets shareholders approved the purchase of the Fay Richwhite Merchant Bank. Had Congreve and Ricketts known of the problems at the BNZ, and they were directors, remember, they could have resigned from one of the boards because of conflicting interests. Other options open to them were to insist that the purchase of the Fay Richwhite Merchant Bank be abandoned, or they could have tried to renegotiate the price down. None of these happened. If in fact Congreve and Ricketts hadn't known about the problems in the BNZ, then Four Corners considers they weren't doing their jobs properly as directors. Certainly capital markets knew enough about the declining fortunes of the BNZ to threaten to sue the Labor government of the day for having been sold a dud a year earlier.
We took legal advice on the point. We reminded capital markets that they had come in with their eyes open, that they had gone through a process of due diligence, albeit a confined process. It may not have been as extensive as it would have been if there had been a normal sale, but that had been their choice.
And where were the regulatory authorities through all this as questions were being raised about the merger and some of the associated manoeuvrings? Chairman of the Securities Commission, Peter Mackenzie, has a budget of just $1.8 million a year and a staff of 12 to police corporate behaviour in New Zealand. He decided to stay on the sidelines.
That was a rather different situation. We do, of course, keep a general eye on market situations, and we comment where we feel that's necessary and desirable. But we've not held a formal inquiry into that particular matter.
The BNZ last week announced a return to the black with a profit of $171 million. Shareholders may be forgiven for being sceptical given that the bank claimed a profit back in 1990, only months before it had to be rescued. In the meantime, negotiations are continuing over the sale of the bank to a foreign buyer. After the BNZ, New Zealand has only a handful of major public businesses left to sell. The rich stream of fees which has swelled Fay Richwhite's earnings is drying up. On top of this, Fay Richwhite suffered a rare public setback recently when it advised the Auckland Regional Council on the sale of the city's port. Auckland is the country's largest port, covering several hundred hectares of prime waterfront land on 2 harbours. Councillor Bruce Jesson challenged the need for the sale and the role of Fay Richwhite in the process.
Oh, they were totally committed, which is not surprising considering the money they were going to get out of it. In a sense, they had a conflict of interest there. They had, on the one hand, were providing advice to the council, which was totally one-sided, and they're going to make all these fees and all this money out of it.
There was an announcement that, yes, they were going ahead with the sale. No one had known. It had been a secret, cosy arrangement. There'd been no public notification, although they said there had been some sort of public polling of people's opinions about selling the ports of Auckland. But no one I know had ever been polled, and certainly none of our listeners, no one ever said they were polled. There'd been this meeting, the council announced they were going to sell it, and it just exploded. People's anger over big business prosperity in New Zealand, as opposed to how the rest of the country is going at the moment, just became focused on this sale.
Good morning, Radio Pacific. How are you?
We're facing this crime.
Pam Corkery asked her listeners to express their views, and she was swamped by 38,000 letters opposing the sale. Fay Richwhite had so misread the community reaction that it hired a public relations firm to discredit Pam Corkery's efforts.
It does seem more this legislated stratification that we're suffering. It was quite good because I found out my market value. They spent $175,000 on a destabilising campaign to really shoot the bum out of my campaign, which was duly leaked to me, saying it was a publicity stunt and how they should present a better front for the, things in favour of selling the ports. So that was $175,000 of ratepayer money again, New Zealanders' money again, to destabilise their opposition.
Pam Corkery's campaign had picked the public mood so well, the council was forced to abandon the port sale. This left ratepayers with a bill for $1.2 million in fees to Fay Richwhite, lawyers and the public relations firm. It became symbolic too of wider community discontent over privatisation.
I suppose there's a growing perception that a lot is being imposed on New Zealand that we gave no mandate for. That's the bigger picture of the New Zealand disenchantment with the government. The ports was such a focus for mainly this asset sale, which is the cornerstone of the national government. Get out of public ownership.
What is the advantage of turning a public monopoly into a private one? For the ordinary taxpayer, of course, it's usually that he or she has no control anymore over that asset. Now, it's yet to be proven that we have got the degree of efficiency to make the arrangements towards privatisation in the benefit of ordinary New Zealanders. I certainly don't believe that the average everyday New Zealander thinks so at the moment.
If Winston Peters is correct, then the New Zealand experiment may have run its course. The country is still burdened with foreign debt twice the level of Australia's, despite the fact that it sold $8 billion worth of its most prized public assets. Do governments press on then with their experiment, or do they change tack?
I wouldn't abandon free market policies, but they have a serious limitation. The market has serious flaws, and internationally other governments understand that. New Zealand needs to get into greater economic planning in terms of developmental economics of the type followed by the very successful Asian countries, Japan, West Germany, Norway in particular, for example. We've got to have an international strategy for the engagement of our products and services.
The big winners from past policies in New Zealand have been the rich. Free market economics has concentrated New Zealand's declining wealth in the upper income brackets. Unemployment is the highest since the 1930s depression. As a result, there is rising disillusionment with the two main political parties. Desney Harris is one of a growing number of voters who have turned to third parties out of sheer desperation. She has signed up with New Labour, a breakaway Labour party which yearns for the policies and prosperity of the 1960s.
The Labour Party's sort of done a bit of a backtrack, but their credibility's gone. They're the ones who started through Rogernomics, the free market policies that the National Party have just continued with. They've just got no support, no trust in them anymore.
Any scientific evidence that there is, and I'm going on the polls now of disenchanted won't say, don't know and refuse to say votes, they sometimes have been up to 42% in New Zealand. Now, that's an alarming trend in a democracy.
You study the history of it since 1851. Everyone has their day. The Aussies did after 25 years. I think the Kiwis can after 8 years. With luck, ladies and gentlemen, by this time next year, that old mug, for what it's worth, should be well and safely ensconced in the Commodore's woolshed.
Now that Michael Fay has failed to deliver his pledge of bringing the America's Cup to New Zealand, any hope of a cup-led property boom in Auckland and even a trickle-down wealth boost for the rest of the country has evaporated. Sir Michael Fay is now looking across the Tasman to the rich pickings in Australia, where he wants to lend his experience to the Conservative parties eager to set off on that same free market trail blazed by New Zealand 8 years ago. But the majority of New Zealanders must go back to waiting and hoping that they will start reaping some benefits after bearing the brunt of the cost of their country's ambitious experiment.